She arrived on a Thursday with everything she owned in a single trash bag. That was the first thing he noticed, how little there was to show for 7 years of life. For Mike, a rancher used to fixing broken fences and sick calves, this was a different kind of broken. This wasn't about saving a life from a single moment of danger. This was about rebuilding one from years of silence, from 7 different temporary beds, from the specific trauma that tells a child they are not worth keeping. And he knew, right then, a roof and meals weren't going to be enough. She would need a door she could close, a wall that was hers, a space in the world that for the first time would not be temporary. Mike wasn't a social worker. He was a man of rough hands and simple solutions who'd spent his life on 1,000 acres of quiet. But the system that had failed this child, a carousel of temporary beds and goodbye hugs, was a problem he couldn't fix with a tractor or a fence. His solution was the only one he had: to build, to take wood and nails and create the one thing she'd never had, a place that would, for the first time, be hers. The numbers are a cold kind of violence. Of the over 400,000 children in the system, 59% of those in care for more than 2 years will be moved at least 3 times. Each move is a rupture, a loss of friends, school, the few familiar things that whisper safe. For the child who arrived at Mike's ranch, we'll call her Lily, that number was 7. 7 homes in 7 years. Her case file was a ledger of loss: entered care at 2 due to neglect, shuttled between relatives, then a succession of foster families where she was, as one note read, quiet and compliant. A dangerous phrase. It doesn't mean a child is okay. It means they've stopped expecting to be heard. Mike and his wife, Sarah, had been respite providers for years, a short-term safe harbor for kids in transition. But Lily's placement in the spring was different. It was meant to be long-term foster, a phrase that sounds permanent but in the bureaucratic language of child welfare means almost nothing. It means until something changes. For Lily, everything had always changed. She didn't unpack her bag for 2 weeks. She slept on top of the covers, her shoes placed neatly by the bed, a silent protocol of readiness learned through bitter experience. Mike watched her. He saw the way she traced the pattern on the spare room's wallpaper, a generic pastoral scene she'd inherited from a guest who'd never come. The room wasn't hers. It was a utility, a stopping point. And for a child whose entire identity had been formed in the limbo between families, the message was clear: you are a guest here too. Your presence is temporary. This is perhaps the core wound of foster care, the systemic reinforcement of impermanence. It creates what experts call toxic stress, a constant, wearing anxiety that rewires a developing brain for hypervigilance and distrust. Sarah saw it in the food hoarding: little packets of crackers tucked under the mattress, a banana hidden in a drawer. It wasn't defiance. It was the brilliant, heartbreaking logic of a body that has learned scarcity, that doesn't trust the next meal will come. Mike saw it in the land. Lily would follow him on his rounds, a small shadow at a safe distance. She wasn't interested in the horses or the new calves. She was fascinated by the fences. Her small hands would touch the taut wires, the solid posts. She'd test the gates. In her world of shifting social workers and uncertain tomorrows, she was drawn to the only things on the ranch that promised a clear boundary. Here is in, there is out. This will hold. The idea came to Mike not as a lightning bolt, but as a slow, solid certainty, like the sinking of a fence post. It was a Tuesday evening. Lily had been asked at school to draw a picture of her bedroom. She brought home a sheet of paper with a careful, precise drawing of a bed floating in the middle of an empty, white space. No walls, no door, no window, just a bed adrift. Sarah had to leave the kitchen. Mike sat at the table with the drawing, the quiet of the ranch pressing in, and he understood the assignment in a way no teacher ever could. She wasn't showing them a room. She was showing them her world. He found Sarah in the garden. "We're building her a room," he said, "not adding on, not repurposing, building from the ground up. A square of space on this earth that would be conceived, framed, and finished with her in mind. A space with walls she could touch and say, 'These are mine.'" Sarah, practical and compassionate, saw the obstacles, the cost, the time. The fact that they were still foster parents, not adoptive parents. The system, with its endless approvals and home studies, doesn't have a checkbox for build a child a sanctuary. It has boxes for fire extinguishers and outlet covers. What if they move her? Sarah asked, the real fear hanging in the air. Mike looked back toward the house. Then she'll have had it for a while, he said. That was the gamble, the act of faith that defied the system's entire logic. To invest deeply, lavishly in a child you may not get to keep. To build a permanent thing for a temporarily assigned life. It was a rebellion. The next day he didn't call a contractor. He went to the lumber yard. He bought pine 2x4s, sheets of plywood, insulation. He loaded it all into his truck himself. The physicality of it was a language he spoke fluently. Plan, measure, cut, join, cause and effect. A world that made sense. He chose a spot off the back porch looking west toward the pastures. He laid out the lines with string and spray paint right on the grass. A simple rectangle, 12 by 16. When Lily came home from school, the outline was there, a ghost of a room on the ground. She stopped and stared. Mike walked over, his boots scuffing the dirt. "See that?" he said, pointing. "That's going to be your room. You and me are gonna build it." He didn't say, "I'm going to build you a room." He said, "We." He handed her a hammer. It was heavy in her small hand. She looked from the tool to the painted lines on the ground, her face unreadable. The first nail she tried to drive bent hopelessly. Mike showed her again. The second one sank in, straight and true. That was the beginning, the commitment made visible, but the system was about to remind them of its power. A week into the project, with the floor joists framed and waiting, the caseworker came for a scheduled visit. Ms. Gable was kind, overworked, and ruled by a binder of regulations. She saw the construction site from her car window. Her smile tightened. The meeting in the kitchen was tense. "This is a significant alteration to the home environment," she said, pen poised over her checklist. "Unapproved structural modifications can be a licensing issue," Mike explained. It wasn't a modification, it was an addition, for Lily. Ms. Gable sighed, the sound of someone caught between a heart and a rulebook. "The placement is still being assessed for long-term viability. There's a paternal relative who's expressed interest, a great-uncle, in another state." The air left the room. The great-uncle, a phantom from a file, a man none of them had met, who hadn't shown interest for 7 years, but whose existence now wielded the legal power to unravel everything. The biological family preference is a cornerstone of child welfare, and for good reason. Reunification is the gold standard, but in practice, it can be a club. A distant relative's sudden, vague interest could trigger a home study, a court hearing, and a transfer across state lines, breaking a child's fragile attachments all over again. Sarah's hand found Mike's under the table. Her fingers were cold. Ms. Gable closed her binder. "I'm not saying it will happen. I'm saying the process has started. You should temper your expectations." She meant the room. She meant their hearts. After she left, Mike stood at the kitchen window, watching Lily water the seedlings she'd planted in little cups. The foundation hole gaped in the yard, a raw wound in the earth. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name. A great-uncle, a court date, another state. The safe, predictable logic of construction had crashed into the chaotic, painful logic of the system. Every swing of the hammer now was an act of defiance. Every board nailed was a bet placed against the odds. That night, Mike went back out to the site with a work light. He knelt in the dirt, alone, and drove the anchor bolts for the sill plate, the first permanent connection between the new room and the solid ground of the ranch. The steel bit deep into the concrete footing. He tightened each nut until his wrench could turn no more. It felt less like building and more like laying a claim. This will be here. She will be here. But the system was moving in the background. A letter arrived from the county courthouse. A notification of a permanency planning hearing in 30 days. The goal stated, placement with kin. The great-uncle had filed a petition. The cliffhanger wasn't a nail-biting rescue from physical danger. It was quieter and far more devastating. It was the sound of a judge's gavel, yet to fall, that could declare that the room taking shape in the dirt and the family taking shape around this quiet child were once again just another temporary arrangement. Mike had the walls framed and standing by the following weekend, skeletal and brave against the big sky. Lily would sit inside the outline of her future room on the subfloor and read a book, as if willing it into being. The race was now irrevocably on. Could he build a home faster than the system could take her away? The great uncle had a name, Frank, and Frank, it turned out, wasn't a monster. He was a 68-year-old retired truck driver living in a mobile home park in Arizona who'd only learned about Lily's existence when a court investigator tracked him down. He told them he was willing to help. In the language of the system, that single phrase became a tidal wave. Biological kin, willing. It checked two of the most powerful boxes on the permanency checklist. It didn't matter that he hadn't seen her since she was an infant, or that his home study would take weeks. The momentum had shifted. The goal was no longer long-term foster care with the current providers. The printed words from the court now read, exploring placement with paternal kin. Mike received this update in a terse email from Ms. Gable. He read it on his phone, standing in the framed-out room, the scent of fresh pine sawdust in the air. The disconnect was dizzying. In one reality, he was sheathing walls, creating something solid and real. In the other, a bureaucrat in an office hundreds of miles away was typing words that could render it all a beautiful, useless monument. He didn't tell Lily about Frank, but children are seismographs for adult anxiety. She became clingier. She'd appear silently at his elbow while he worked, handing him nails one at a time, a small ritual of usefulness. Sarah, ever the researcher, dove into the law. She discovered the kinship preference was a double-edged sword. Designed to preserve cultural and family ties, it could also place children with virtual strangers simply because they shared DNA, often bypassing deeper forged bonds with foster families. "It's not about who she knows," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. "It's about who she's related to. Her sense of family is being built right here, and the law doesn't have a metric for that." They decided to fight, not against Frank but for Lily. They petitioned the court to be considered as fictive kin, a legal term for adults who have a family-like bond with a child. It was a long shot. They hired a soft-spoken but ferocious lawyer named Angela Ruiz, who specialized in child welfare cases. Her first question to them was brutal in its simplicity. "Are you prepared to adopt her? Because that's the only endpoint that beats a willing blood relative." The question hung in their living room. Adoption. They hadn't let themselves say the word. Foster care trains you to hold dreams at arm's length. To adopt is to reach out and grab hold, knowing the system can prise your fingers loose. Mike looked at Sarah, and in her eyes he saw the same terrifying yes he felt in his own bones. "We are," Sarah said. Angela nodded. "Then we have a path, a narrow one. We need to show the court that removing her from this environment would cause serious psychological harm. We need a child therapist's evaluation. We need character witnesses. And we need," she said, glancing out the window at the construction, "to demonstrate that her permanency is already being physically realized here. That room is no longer just a room. It's Exhibit A." Now the build took on a legal urgency. Every nail was evidence. Every installed window was testimony. Mike worked with a frantic, focused energy. He enlisted help. His neighbor, an old carpenter named Gus, showed up one morning with his toolbox. "Heard you could use a hand," Gus grunted, and without another word started framing the interior wall for a closet. The community, once just a background presence, began to lean in. Lily's teacher sent home a card signed by her classmates. "We hope you get to stay in your new room." The local hardware store, hearing the story, gave Mike a contractor's discount on the siding. This private act of love was becoming a public statement. Meanwhile, the system's gears kept turning. A video call was scheduled so Lily could meet Frank. It was conducted in Ms. Gable's office, with Lily sitting stiffly in front of a tablet. Mike and Sarah waited outside, straining to hear muffled tones. On screen, Frank was a kindly-faced man with a nervous smile. He asked her about school, about what she liked to do. Lily answered in monosyllables. "Do you like animals?" Frank asked. Lily, for the first time, perked up. "Mike has horses," she said softly. "I help feed them." There was a pause on the other end. Well, I got a cat, Frank said. The connection was thin, a thread. After 10 minutes it was over. The report would later state, child was polite but reserved. No overt negative reactions observed. In the system, neutrality is often read as potential. The therapist's evaluation was the next battlefield. Dr. Evans spent 3 sessions with Lily, using play and drawings. Her report was a bombshell of clinical language that spelled out a human tragedy. She diagnosed Lily with an adjustment disorder with anxiety and noted clear signs of reactive attachment disorder, stemming from early neglect and repeated placement disruptions. The key passage was this: the patient has begun to form a secure attachment with her current caregivers, as evidenced by reduced hypervigilance, decreased food hoarding, and verbalized feelings of safety. Disruption of this primary attachment at this critical stage would likely precipitate a significant regression, exacerbate trauma symptoms, and could cause long-term damage to her capacity for healthy relationships. Her psychological permanency is coalescing around her current home. A move, even to a benign relative, would be experienced as another profound abandonment. Angela called it a game changer, but the court had to agree to read it, and Frank's lawyer, a court-appointed advocate, was arguing that blood is blood, and that a fresh start with family, away from the trauma reminders of her past in state care, was the cleaner solution. It was a classic clash of philosophies, the past versus the future, biology versus biography. Through all this, the room grew. The roof went on, tar paper shining under the sun. The siding went up, painted a soft, creamy yellow that Sarah let Lily choose from a dozen sample chips. Lily's ownership of the space became tangible. She insisted on painting one small section of the interior wall herself. Mike set up a roller for her, and she covered a patch in enthusiastic, uneven strokes of lavender. It was her mark, her claim. Then 2 weeks before the hearing, the unexpected pivot. Angela called, her voice buzzing with cautious intrigue. "We got Frank's home study report," she said. It was a standard document, financial records, criminal background check, clean, references from neighbors. But buried in the social worker's narrative interview was a sentence that changed everything. Frank, when asked about his motivation, had reportedly said, "I just want what's best for her. I'm old, my place is small. If she's happy and safe where she is, I don't want to be the reason she gets hurt again." He wasn't fighting for her. He was responding to the system's call because he felt a vague familial duty. The kinship preference was pushing him forward more than his own desire was. Angela saw an opening. "We need to get him on the phone without the lawyers, man to man." Mike was terrified. This was the man who could take Lily away, but Angela insisted. "He's not the enemy. The policy is the enemy. Make him see her, really see her." Mike made the call from his truck parked at the edge of the pasture. Frank answered on the third ring. Mike introduced himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was a long silence. Then Frank said, "Yeah, I figured you'd call." What followed wasn't a confrontation. It was a painful, halting conversation between two men utterly out of their depth. Mike talked about Lily, not as a case but as a person. Her fear of storms, her laugh when the barn cat chased a butterfly, the way she'd finally started leaving her shoes off at night. He told him about the room. "She painted part of it purple," Mike said, his voice cracking. "It's the first thing she's ever picked out for herself." Frank was quiet for so long Mike thought the line had dropped. Then he heard a shaky exhale. "I got pictures of her dad," Frank said. "My nephew, he was lost, drugs, he wasn't there for her. I guess I felt I had to be." Another pause. "But I'm not a kid person, my life's quiet. This trailer, it's not a place for a little girl to grow up." The confession was monumental. The willing relative was, in fact, deeply reluctant. He was being willing because he thought it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted to. Mike seized the fragile thread. "What if the right thing," he said slowly, carefully, "was to let her stay where she's already growing? You could still be her great uncle. You could visit. She could know where she comes from without having to leave where she belongs." Silence this time was different, contemplative. "I'd have to talk to my lawyer," Frank said finally, but the tone had shifted. The wall of kinship preference had a human-sized door in it. Mike got off the phone, his hands trembling. He had just negotiated with the threat, and the threat had turned out to be a lonely old man haunted by family failures. This changed the entire calculus of the hearing. It was no longer the state versus the foster parents. It was becoming, what does Lily need? But the system hates ambiguity. The day after the call, Angela received a motion from the county attorney. They were opposing the fictive kin petition. They argued that Frank's willingness, however qualified, must be fully explored before non-relative strangers could be considered for permanent placement. The hearing would proceed as scheduled. All the human understanding in the world still had to funnel through the cold, narrow pipeline of procedure. The bridge to the hearing was now a tightrope. Frank's potential support was a possibility, not a promise. The room was nearly done, but the legal foundation beneath it felt more precarious than ever. The walls were painted, the floor sanded smooth. All that remained was the trim work, the final touches, and the decision of a judge who held in their hands the power to make this beautiful, finished space the setting for a future, or the setting for a final, heartbreaking goodbye. The day before the hearing, the county attorney filed a new motion. It wasn't about Frank, it was about Mike. A routine background check renewal had flagged a decades-old misdemeanor, a bar fight when he was 22. It was meaningless, but the motion argued it called into question the stability and judgment of the foster home. It was a bureaucratic torpedo aimed below the waterline. Angela was furious. This is a stunt. They're scrambling because the therapist's report is so strong. They're trying to muddy the water, but stunts work. The judge, now obligated to consider all new evidence, granted a continuance. The hearing was pushed back 30 days. Another month of limbo. Another month where Lily's room stood complete but empty, a furnished promise she wasn't allowed to fully inhabit. The psychological toll was immediate and brutal. For Lily, who had begun to trust the rhythm of after the hearing, the delay was an incomprehensible betrayal. She stopped talking about the room. She stopped going out to see it. One night, Sarah found her sitting on the floor of the spare bedroom, repacking her trash bag. Not everything, just a few things. A practiced ritual of preparedness. Sarah sank down beside her, tears streaming silently, and didn't try to take the bag away. She just said, "We are not giving up. We are fighting for you every single day." Lily didn't look up. "Okay," she whispered, the most heartbreaking word in the English language. Mike channeled his rage into the only action he had left, perfection. He finished the room. He installed the trim with painstaking precision. He hung a porch swing outside her window. He built a bookshelf and filled it with books they'd read together. The room was a masterpiece of love, and it sat there, a silent rebuke to the process that was failing her. But the system, once set in motion, develops a terrifying inertia. With the hearing delayed, the county's focus shifted back to Frank. A new caseworker was assigned to facilitate a transition plan. The words transition plan turned Sarah's blood to ice. It meant they were actively planning to move her. Then the revelation that changed the battlefield entirely. Angela, digging through the court file, found a discrepancy. Frank's home study, which had been approved, contained a critical error. The social worker had listed his mobile home as having 3 bedrooms. Public records showed it was a 2-bedroom model. Furthermore, one of those bedrooms was being used as a storage room for Frank's late wife's belongings, which he told the worker he was unable to sort through. The home study was flawed. Materially flawed. Angela filed an emergency motion to invalidate it and for a new, independent evaluation. The court granted it. Frank's viability as a placement was suddenly, formally, in question. But here, where it got worse. The county, now backed into a corner, made a stunning countermove. They didn't defend Frank's home. They abandoned it. In a new filing, they pivoted entirely. They argued that since the kinship placement was now problematic, and the current foster home was under review due to the background issue, the appropriate course was to place Lily in a new, neutral foster home while a comprehensive assessment was completed. They were proposing to remove her from Mike and Sarah entirely. A cooling-off period, they called it. It was the nuclear option. To protect the child from adult conflict, they would inflict the very trauma everyone claimed to want to avoid. Angela read the filing aloud over the phone, her voice shaking with a professional fury Mike had never heard. They're willing to bounce her to stranger to win the argument. This isn't about her anymore. This is about the county covering its liability. Mike felt the world drop out from under him. They could lose her not to family, but to the soulless machinery of the state itself. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the finished room in the dark, on the bed meant for Lily, and he broke. The sobs were silent, violent things, wrenched from a place he'd kept locked since his own childhood losses. He was failing. The walls he'd built were just wood. They couldn't protect her. The community's response was the counterweight. Gus the carpenter heard about the county's new plan. He called every tradesman he knew. The next day, a local news reporter, tipped off by a friend of Sarah's from the school, showed up at the ranch. Mike, exhausted and desperate, gave an interview. He didn't rant. He just stood in front of Lily's room and stated the facts. "We were asked to love a child who had no one. We did. We were asked to provide a stable home. We did. Now, because we want to make that permanent, they want to take her away and put her with strangers. I don't understand what lesson that teaches her." The segment aired that night. The public reaction was immediate and volcanic. The county's child services office was flooded with calls and emails. A petition started online, gathering thousands of signatures in hours. The story had escaped the closed system of family court and entered the court of public opinion. This forced a second emergency hearing. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Wilkins, was not pleased. "I do not appreciate my courtroom being tried in the media," she stated flatly, but she acknowledged the urgent and unusual circumstances. This hearing was different. Frank was present via video link, looking small and confused. The county attorney argued for neutral placement. Angela presented the flawed home study and the therapist's report on the catastrophic impact of another move. Then she did something bold. She called Mike to the stand. Under oath, Mike was asked why he built the room. He spoke not to the lawyer but to the judge. "Your Honor, she didn't know what a home was. She knew checklists and rules and trash bags. I know how to build things that last. I wanted her to see that something could be made for her that wouldn't go away. I wanted her to have a corner of the world that was hers so she could finally stop being ready to leave." The judge listened, her expression unreadable. Then Angela played her final card. "The court has heard from everyone but the child. Lily is 7. She is articulate. I request the court interview her in chambers, as allowed under statute." The county objected vehemently. Judge Wilkins overruled them. "I will speak with her." Lily was brought into the judge's private office with only a court advocate present. No lawyers, no foster parents. 10 minutes later, Lily came out clutching the advocate's hand. Her face was pale but set. No one knew what was said. The attorneys were recalled. Judge Wilkins looked from the county attorney to Angela to Frank's pixelated face on the screen. "The child's wishes are clear," she said. "But wishes are not the only factor. Mr. Franklin, you have been found to be a willing relative, but your home is not currently suitable, and your connection to the child is minimal. The current foster parents have a significant bond with the child, but there is a pending review of their home. The county's proposal for a neutral placement is, in my view, the most traumatic option available and is rejected." She steepled her fingers. "Here is my order. First, the current foster home's license is provisionally renewed, pending a swift review of the ancient misdemeanor matter, which I find to be a non-issue. Second, Mr. Franklin will undergo a new, independent home study, with specific attention to creating appropriate space and his long-term plan. Third, and this is non-negotiable, during this additional 60-day assessment period, the child will remain in her current placement. She will, effective today, be allowed to move into the new room. Fourth, I am ordering therapeutic visitation between the child and Mr. Franklin to be supervised here in this state to determine if a relationship is viable and in her best interest." It was a Solomonic ruling that pleased no one and exhausted everyone, but it contained one miraculous line: "The child will be allowed to move into the new room." Lily could sleep in her room that night. The legal purgatory continued, but the physical claim was sanctioned. When they got home, Mike carried Lily's few belongings from the spare room to the new one. She walked in, her feet bare on the smooth wood floor. She didn't say anything. She just went to the lavender wall and pressed her palm against it. Then she went to the bed, climbed in, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. She looked at Mike and Sarah standing in the doorway, and for the first time in weeks she smiled. A real, unguarded, sunlight-through-clouds smile. "It's my room," she said. It was a statement of fact. But the victory was fragile. The war wasn't over. Frank's new home study was a ticking clock. The therapeutic visits were a minefield of potential emotional confusion. The county, chastened but not defeated, was watching. Mike and Sarah had won a battle, not the campaign. They had 60 days. 60 days for Frank to either become a real grandfather figure or to realize the distance was too great. 60 days to prove to the system once and for all that biology isn't destiny and that love isn't just a feeling. It's a series of actions, hammered into place like nails in solid wood, creating a structure that can shelter a life. The room was finally a bedroom. Now they had to make sure it could become a home permanently. The final test was no longer about construction. It was about connection. And the most important connection of all was the one that had to be made, or gently unmade, with a lonely old man in Arizona. The therapeutic visits began at a park, halfway between the ranch and the airport. Frank flew in, looking uncomfortable in a stiff new shirt. Lily held Sarah's hand like a vice. The therapist's goal was simple: facilitate interaction, observe attachment. For the first 20 minutes, it was a disaster of polite silence. Frank showed Lily pictures on his phone of his cat, of the desert sunsets. Lily nodded. Then Frank awkwardly pointed to the playground. "You want to go on the swings?" Lily looked at Sarah, who gave an encouraging nod. "Okay," she said. Mike watched from a bench, his heart a trapped bird in his chest. He saw Frank push the swing, gently at first, then with more vigor as Lily's quiet "higher" reached his ears. He saw her hair fly out behind her, and for a flicker of a second he saw a little girl on a swing, not a case file. When the hour was up, Lily ran back, flushed. "He pushes good," she declared to Sarah. It wasn't love, it was a data point. But in the realm of forced connection, it was a start. Frank came to the ranch for the second visit. Mike had vowed to be civil. He showed Frank the horses, the barn. Frank was shy, respectful. He didn't try to act like he belonged. He was a visitor. He saw Lily's room. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, and took it in. The lavender wall, the books, the quilt. "You built all this?" he asked Mike, his voice full of a wonder that had nothing to do with carpentry. Mike just nodded. Frank looked at Lily, who was sitting on her bed watching him. "It's a real nice room, sweetheart," he said, and his voice cracked. He didn't go in. That night Frank called Mike. "I got the report from the new home study lady," he said, no preamble. "She said the space is adequate but not ideal. She asked me about my health, my plans." He paused. "She asked me if I was doing this because I wanted a child or because I felt guilty about my nephew." Another pause, longer. I didn't have a good answer. The visits continued. They baked cookies with Sarah. Frank told Lily stories about her dad as a little boy, goofy, harmless stories about him trying to fish in a drainage ditch. Lily listened, storing the information like rare artifacts. A picture of her biological father was forming, not as a monster, but as a sad, lost man. It was a gentler truth. Meanwhile, the independent social worker completed her evaluation of Mike and Sarah's home. The result was a foregone conclusion, but a relief nonetheless. Exceptionally stable, nurturing, and permanent environment. The ancient misdemeanor was noted and dismissed as irrelevant to current capacity. With 30 days left in the assessment period, the therapist convened a meeting with all the adults. Her assessment was clinical but clear. Lily has formed a secure primary attachment to Mike and Sarah. Her sense of safety is rooted there, in that physical space and the routines of that home. Her relationship with Mr. Franklin is positive, but it is a friendly, grandparent-like connection. It is not, and at this stage cannot become, a parental attachment. To remove her from her primary attachment figures would be devastating. She turned to Frank. Mr. Franklin, your presence in her life is valuable. It gives her a sense of biological continuity, but it must be secondary to her primary home. Frank listened, his old face a map of wrinkles and resignation. He looked at Mike, then at Sarah. I know, he said, so quiet it was almost a whisper. I seen it, she's their kid. The surrender in those words wasn't defeat. It was clarity. It was love in its most unselfish form. The final hearing was anticlimactic in the best possible way. The county, seeing the unanimous reports from the therapist and the independent assessor, and facing the continued public scrutiny, dropped its opposition. Frank's lawyer stood and stated that his client, after meaningful reflection and interaction, believed it was in Lily's best interest to remain in her current home and was withdrawing his petition for placement. He requested formal visitation rights. Judge Wilkins, for the first time in the entire saga, smiled. She granted the adoption petition filed by Mike and Sarah. She established a visitation order for Frank, 2 weeks in the summer, holidays at their discretion. She finalized it with the strike of a gavel. The sound was clean, final. It was over. They celebrated not with a party, but with a quiet dinner at home. Frank was there, his last night before flying back. Lily sat between Mike and Sarah, beaming. She called Frank Uncle Frank now. After dinner, she showed him how to feed the horses a sugar cube from a flat palm. He fumbled, laughed, and did it. Standing in the barn, watching the old man and the little girl, Mike felt the last knot of anxiety in his chest unravel. This wasn't a victory over anyone. It was an expansion. Family had grown, not shrunk. The surprising detail came a month after the adoption was final. A package arrived for Lily from Arizona. Inside was not a toy, but a heavy, framed photograph. It was a picture of her biological father, around 10 years old, grinning on a bicycle. On the back, in Frank's shaky script, it read, "For your wall, so you know where you come from. Love, Uncle Frank." Lily studied the picture for a long time. Then she took it into her room. She didn't put it on the bookshelf with her other things. She asked Mike to hang it on the wall opposite her bed. "So I can see him," she said. It wasn't a source of sadness. It was a piece of her puzzle, given a place of honor in the sanctuary built for her. The room could hold all of her, past, present, and future. The construction was complete. The legal battles were done. But the building, the real building, was just beginning. It was in the slow, patient work of helping a child believe that the walls around her would never vanish, that the hands that built them would never let go. The data tells us that stability is the single greatest predictor of success for children from trauma. One study of former foster youth found that those who achieved permanency with a family were 69% more likely to graduate high school and 41% less likely to experience homelessness. Mike and Sarah had given Lily more than a room. They had given her a statistical chance at a whole life. A year later, Lily's nighttime ritual no longer includes checking that her shoes are by the bed. The trash bag is long gone, replaced by a dresser full of clothes. She still visits the lavender wall sometimes, touching the paint like a talisman. Frank visits every summer. He and Mike drink lemonade on the porch and talk about the weather, about the horses, about nothing at all. They are bound together not by blood, but by a little girl they both love in different, complementary ways. The room, once a frantic act of defiance against a broken system, is now just a room. A room with scuff marks on the floor and books piled haphazardly on the shelf. A room that contains the ordinary, messy evidence of a childhood that is finally allowed to be ordinary. That is the ultimate payoff. Not the dramatic courtroom victory, but the quiet mornings, the forgotten homework, the sound of a child sleeping deeply behind a door that is, irrevocably, hers. Mike's hands, which once pulled nails and raised walls to save her, now mostly just ruffle her hair or help her with a math problem. The rescue was the hammering. The life is the quiet that comes after. So what do we make of a story like this? On one level, it's a victory. One child out of over 70,000 waiting found permanency. But the mechanics of that victory reveal everything that's still broken. A system that almost severed a child from the only secure attachment she'd ever known because a checkbox for biological relative outweighed a mountain of evidence about her psychological home. The miracle here isn't that the system worked. It's that love was stubborn enough, and a community loud enough, to force the system to see a child as a person, not a case. Lily's story is a single data point against a staggering statistic. Of the children who age out of foster care each year without a permanent family, nearly a third will experience homelessness by age 26. The difference between those two futures isn't just policy. It's often the decisive intervention of a single adult who refuses to let go. Mike wasn't a hero. He was a man with a skill, building things that last, who applied it to the most fragile thing he'd ever been given. That's the replicable magic. Not everyone can build a room, but everyone can build consistency. Everyone can show up. Everyone can be the one person in a child's life who doesn't disappear. The deeper question the story leaves us with is this: what does family mean? Is it the echo of shared DNA, or is it the daily, deliberate choice to be someone's safe harbor? Frank's greatest act of love wasn't claiming Lily. It was letting her go, while choosing to stay in her life as a grandfather figure. He redefined family from a claim of ownership to a gift of connection. And in doing so, he gave Lily permission to belong fully to the people who had chosen her every day. We fixate on the dramatic rescue, the child pulled from the creek, but the harder, more profound work is the years that come after. The building, the listening, the staying. It's unglamorous. It doesn't fit in a headline, but it's the only thing that ever truly heals the wound of impermanence. For every child still waiting, their version of a room might just be a seat at your dinner table, a consistent Saturday afternoon, a promise kept. This is where we leave them. Mike, Sarah, Lily, and Frank, a family assembled by tragedy, forged in a courtroom and cemented by choice. The system will churn on with its forms and its hearings and its heartbreaking delays. But in one quiet corner of a ranch, a little girl goes to sleep behind a lavender wall in a room built just for her by hands that promise to stay. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful rebellion of all: to create a permanent world for one child, in defiance of all the forces that said she wasn't worth keeping. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. We tell these stories not just because they're compelling, but because they remind us of our own capacity to build something that lasts. Thanks for watching.